Dan, let's start with the Essendon Football Club. Last week, the big news, I might even venture to categorise it, perhaps one of the biggest line in the sand, big breaking stories that affects our culture here in Australia, where the Essendon Football Club's newly appointed CEO, Andrew Thorburn, was forced to resign due to his Christian beliefs and church involvement. You've obviously been monitoring that along too. What are your perceptions, Dan?
Well, it's an interesting one, Neil. I think it's useful for us to categorise this, in the context. So first of all, Israel Folau 2019, that was about his freedom of speech. He said something. Then the Manly 7 earlier this year was about freedom from enforced speech. They didn't want to wear a jersey that said something. And now Andrew Thorburn, another football story, is about freedom of association. So Andrew has said nothing, but attends. In fact, he's the chairman of the board of City on a Hill in Melbourne. Now, and what is an issue here is his association. So I don't think it's very relevant, Neil, that he's the chairman of the board, because any church member, if he was merely a church member, they might have found out, well, you go to City on a Hill. They have said this in a sermon in 2013. What they said was homosexuality is a sin, but they, was a very supportive set of statements, and in there was the phrase homosexuality is a sin. They also said that, we look back and we grieve at the Holocaust. We may look back later and grieve in a similar way about abortion. That was the tone in which all that was said. So this was put to him, and he was basically asked, well, you have to choose your church or the football club, because what's said by City on a Hill, a church which you won't denounce, is inconsistent with our values. So he is being strung up for associating with a church that has orthodox Christian views. And my concern, Neil, is that if the Essendon Football Club is correct, if that's a correct thing to do, then any employer could target any church-going employee and, assert, well, the church you go to, their values are not consistent with the values of this organisation, so you have to go. So it's really very low watermark for, I suppose, to trip a risk for basically anybody who goes to church.
Anyone who goes to church, and I think you can assess whether you might be at risk, Dan, if your workplace has an inclusion and diversity policy. And there have been workplaces, departments who've been working on these feverishly now for a number of years, trying to get all these things in place. And if your workplace actually has that sort of policy, then that probably puts you a little at risk, doesn't it?
Well, I think so. We don't want to be alarmist, but I don't think we are. We are in a situation now where being a Christian is a risky business, particularly if you're associating with a large corporation. Now, thankfully, not everyone is buying into this madness. I see today that Deloitte Australia's chief executive, Adam Powick, has, defended Andrew Thorburn, says, look, this is wrong. Deloitte's, they'd be as mainstream as any consulting firm. They're saying, look, when you get rid of Christians like this, you miss out on diversity and the different approaches that come with that, and this is wrong. So I'm glad he's not alone in this. I'm glad that we have other corporates speaking up for Andrew Thorburn, but it's concerning. And Neil, we have had, we launched a platform on Friday afternoon to allow people to write to the board of the Essendon Football Club, including its chairman and the AFL, and to say, look, this is absolutely not okay. This is not fair play. This is not something that we will tolerate. And so I imagine that the Essendon Football Club thought, well, look, we'll get a couple of days of bad headlines, but then it will blow over. But in truth, over the course of the weekend, over 10,000 people have written to the club and to its board members complaining that Christians aren't welcome at the club and that football culture has become toxic, and making the point that, why should we be able to go to an Essendon football match but have to leave our faith at the gate? So these complaints are being made, and we are in the process of developing a petition to go to Prime Minister Albanese based on this, saying, look, people want him to bring in actual protections for freedom, freedom from this type of dismissal. So that's underway, Neil, to give people some relevant activity.
Dan, late last week there were calls for reinstatement in the CEO role that came from the opposition leader Peter Dutton, and there are calls or speculation that he might, undertake some level of legal action against the Essendon Football Club now. And given you've got this sort of legal background as a barrister, for listeners, where would that sit legally? Is it possible that he might pursue damages here, and should he? Because perhaps some are saying, well, unless you do fight for this right, it'll be completely lost.
Look, you're absolutely right. Religious belief or activity is a protected attribute under the Victorian Equal Opportunity Act, and that means that an employer cannot discriminate against an employee by reason of religious belief. So the law in Victoria is quite clear that he would have a cause of action. So whether or not he chooses is a matter for him. But he should not have to choose between his job and his religious activity. And other protected attributes there are opinions, body, pregnancy. In other words, you don't have to choose between your job and these things. And for the Essendon Football Club, and my view is that to have put this choice to him, that does constitute unlawful discrimination. Now, I'm not a practicing lawyer. I don't have the final say on this, but I think the wording of the legislation is pretty clear.
Dan, you're a Victorian, and, I can't leave a conversation like this without some reflection on the Victorian Premier, who was owning his own faith as a Catholic and thinks that holding positions on marriage and abortion that Andrew Thorburn holds to be abhorrent. Now, some are saying this is the height of hypocrisy, but isn't it the case that, if you're the Premier of a nation, of a state, as you are in Victoria, and you're holding to the views, or are you saying you're actually aligning yourself with the Catholic Church, that it's the same thing as Andrew Thorburn? Shouldn't the Premier be removed?
Well, on strict logic, yes, because no doubt the Pope and church leaders, including Archbishop Comensoli, would have a view that homosexuality is not in line with the Bible, practicing homosexuality, and that abortion is wrong. And so, if he aligned himself with Catholicism, he would be at risk. But what he actually said was that the comments that made on the City on a Hill website in 2013 in those sermons were bigotry, they were hatred, they were absolutely appalling. So he, is having a bet each way, if you like, but he is certainly coming down very hard on Andrew Thorburn and believes that he is unfit to have any senior leadership role in the Essendon Footy Club or anywhere else in society.
Dan, just to, bring the pressure down here for listeners who might be concerned about holding these sorts of views, that these views that are under contention now, these are mainstream views on marriage and family and the value of life of a baby in the womb, and things that we talk about so often on a program like this, being pro-life, being pro-family. It certainly is a major change that these are no longer considered mainstream. That's something that some people will be very concerned about, but some might be thinking maybe I need to revisit how I think about those views. What are your thoughts just for holding firm? Because those views are not going to be changing. They're still going to be the obvious views that we'll hold on to for generations to come.
Look, I think as faithful Christians, we will be persecuted. And, certainly compared to what happens in countries like Pakistan, this is low-level persecution, but it is persecution nevertheless. So we shouldn't change our views. We should always seek to do our best to be faithful to Jesus, faithful to the Bible, faithful to the creation truth of male and female and the importance of life at every stage. So we must remain faithful even under pressure. That is our Christian calling.